The morning after the worst blizzard of the decade, a man named Ezra Colton pulled on his frozen boots, stepped over the drift that had swallowed his front door, and walked across what used to be the main road of Ridgecrest Gulch, Colorado. Every cabin he passed told the same story. Smoke pipes had gone cold in the night. Door frames had warped under the weight of the snow. Through cracked shutters, he could hear children coughing in the low, urgent voices of parents rationing the last of their firewood. One family had moved their mattresses next to the embers of a dying hearth. Another had gathered into a single room and burned their kitchen chairs. Ezra counted 7 households struggling. He knew them all. He had helped some of them build. Then he stopped at the edge of the settlement. Carved into the face of the low sandstone ridge that most people used only as a windbreak, a thin ribbon of smoke rose steadily from a clay pipe barely visible above the snow. No frantic reloading of the firebox. No frozen door. No coughing children. Just that one thin, calm thread of smoke. It belonged to Margaret Ellison, the widow everyone in Ridgecrest Gulch had been calling foolish for the better part of 2 years. Ezra stood there in the cold for a long moment, staring at that smoke. He had been one of the loudest voices against what she was building. He had used the word reckless more than once. He had, on at least 2 occasions, walked away shaking his head. Now, in the aftermath of a storm that had pushed temperatures down to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius for 3 consecutive nights, her hillside home was the only one in Ridgecrest Gulch that had not struggled to hold heat. He knocked on her door. She answered in her house dress, holding a cup of coffee that was still steaming. To understand what Margaret Ellison built and why the community resisted it so fiercely, you have to go back to fall of 1887 and understand what life looked like in the high country settlements scattered across the southwestern corner of Colorado. The San Juan Mountains do not offer gentle winters. Situated at elevations ranging from 7,000 to over 9,000 feet above sea level, the settlements that had grown up around silver mining operations and small-scale farming faced cold that arrived in October and refused to leave until well into April. Snowfall measured in feet, not inches. Winds that geographers would later describe as katabatic, gravity-driven cold air cascading down from the high peaks, could drop ambient temperatures by 15 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 degrees Celsius in under an hour. The settlers who came to this region brought with them the building knowledge of the eastern seaboard, the Great Plains, and the immigrant traditions of Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia. They knew log cabins. They knew wood frame construction. They knew, in many cases, how to cut and lay limestone or sandstone. What they built, almost universally, was a single-room or 2-room log structure, typically 14 by 18 feet, about 4.3 by 5.5 meters, with a center hearth or a corner fireplace, a loft above for sleeping, and walls filled with whatever insulating material was available: river clay, dried moss, horsehair, sawdust packed between boards. These cabins worked. In mild winters, they worked reasonably well, but in the hard winters, the winters that old-timers would later describe as when the mountains meant it, the arithmetic of heat loss began to overwhelm the simple geometry of these structures. A standard log wall cabin of this era, with wall thickness between 8 and 12 inches, 20 to 30 centimeters, and a single pane glass window on each exposed face, would lose heat through its walls, floor, and ceiling at a rate that demanded near-constant fire maintenance. Local accounts from the period suggest that families in hard winters burned between half a cord and a full cord of seasoned hardwood per week. At the wood prices and availability of the San Juan foothills in 1887, that represented a significant portion of a homestead's annual labor, and a resource that could simply run out. Margaret Ellison had watched 3 winters consume her supply of firewood faster than she could replace it. After the 3rd winter, she began to ask a different question. The daily rhythm of a high-country cabin in winter was built almost entirely around fire management. You woke before dawn to reload the hearth, because if you let it go cold overnight, it could take 40 minutes and considerable wood to bring the interior temperature back from the 30th degree F, roughly 0 to 4 degrees Celsius, to something a family could tolerate for breakfast. You laid your largest logs at the back of the firebox before going to sleep, banking the coals high, hoping the combustion would slow, but hold through the 6 or 7 hours until someone rose again. The fire dictated everything: when to wake, when to sleep, How long a family could be away from the cabin before returning to find the temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, whether a sick child could safely remain indoors, or whether the risk of cold exposure indoors was equal to the risk of moving them. The physics behind this struggle were not mysterious, even if frontier families didn't describe them in scientific terms. Standard log construction, even with clay chinking filling the gaps between timber courses, had an effective insulating value that modern builders would describe as approximately R2 to R4 per wall, meaning that for every 1 degree Fahrenheit of temperature difference between the inside and outside, a modest amount of heat energy was bleeding through each square foot of wall surface every hour. On a night when the outside temperature dropped to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 23 degrees Celsius, and the cabin interior needed to stay near 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 degrees Celsius, that difference of 70 degrees was working against every log and every gap constantly, without pause. The fireplace itself, the standard open-hearth design that most settlers used, was, by modern thermal analysis, a remarkably inefficient device. Up to 80 to 90% of the heat generated by an open hearth goes directly up the chimney flue, driven by convection. The radiant heat that reached the room came from the glowing coals and the heated back wall of the firebox, but this warmth fell off sharply with distance. A family of 5 huddled within 4 feet of an open fire was warm. The sleeping loft 10 feet above was tolerable. The far wall of a 14-foot room, on a hard night, could hold frost. These were not complaints unique to Ridgecrest Gulch. Oral accounts collected from across the San Juan region during this period, preserved in County Historical Society records, described the same pattern. Sufficient warmth near the fire, dangerous cold at the margins, and a relentless demand for fuel that never let a family fully rest. Margaret Ellison understood this pattern better than most. She had been a carpenter's apprentice in her younger years, working alongside her father in Ohio. She knew how a structure held heat, and she knew where it lost it. By the winter of 1887, she had spent 3 hard seasons measuring, not with instruments, but with her hands, her breath, and the level of the woodpile, exactly how much the standard cabin was costing the people who lived in it. She had also spent those 3 winters watching the hillside behind her property, and noticing something no one else seemed to pay attention to. The sandstone ridge behind Margaret's property ran roughly east to west, a low shelf of layered rock, perhaps 30 feet 9 meters, high at its tallest point, worn smooth by centuries of snowmelt and wind. Most settlers in Ridgecrest Gulch treated it as a boundary marker, a place to collect loose stone for foundation work, a natural windbreak that made the east side of the settlement marginally less brutal in a storm. Margaret saw something else. She had first noticed in the winter of 1885, during a particularly cold spell, when the temperature outside dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius for 5 consecutive days. She had gone to the base of the ridge to chip loose sandstone blocks for a repair to her chimney foundation. The work brought her close to a shallow natural recess in the rock face, barely 3 feet deep, perhaps 6 feet wide, where a softer layer of stone had eroded back between 2 harder courses. The air inside that recess was noticeably warmer than the ambient air outside. Not dramatically so. She later described it, in a letter to her sister in Cincinnati that local historical archives have preserved, as perhaps the difference between a cold room and a cool room. But the consistency was what struck her. She returned to that recess on different days, at different hours, in different weather, and the pattern held. The rock face maintained a temperature that fluctuated far less than the open air. On the coldest mornings, the stone at depth held something close to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius, even when the ambient reading outside was well below zero. What Margaret was observing had a physical explanation that geologists and building scientists would later articulate clearly. The earth at any depth below the frost line, typically 3 to 5 feet, roughly 1 to 1.5 meters, in this part of Colorado, maintains a stable temperature year-round, driven by the slow, massive thermal inertia of the ground itself. Surface temperatures oscillate wildly between seasons. Subsurface temperatures do not. In the San Juan foothills, that stable ground temperature ranges between 45 degrees Fahrenheit and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 to 11 degrees Celsius, depending on aspect and depth. To a family burning a quarter would a week try to maintain 60 degrees Fahrenheit inside a drafty log cabin against minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit outside. The difference between starting at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit and starting at 47 degrees Fahrenheit is not a small luxury. It is the difference of 67 degrees of thermal gradient that the fire does not have to overcome. Margaret spent the winter of 1886 thinking. She spent the spring mapping the ridge. She identified a section where the natural cavity was deepest, where the rock was dense sandstone, a material she knew from her father's work held heat slowly and released it even more slowly, and where the face of the ridge was oriented slightly south of east, capturing low winter sun. By the summer of 1887, she had a plan. It was not a modest plan. She intended to excavate a dwelling into the ridge itself. Not a simple dugout like the sod house homesteaders use on the open plains, but a structured, reinforced earth-sheltered home, using the thermal mass of the sandstone as her primary insulating and heat storage medium, with a small but precisely positioned interior hearth to provide the supplemental heat that the rock mass alone could not supply. When she described this plan to her neighbors, the reaction was immediate. They thought she had lost her mind. Margaret Ellison broke ground on the project in late June of 1887, working alone for the first 3 weeks before hiring 2 young men from the mining camp 2 miles east to help with the heavier excavation. The site she had chosen was a natural recess in the south-facing base of the sandstone ridge, a cavity roughly 8 feet deep and 11 feet wide, about 2.4 by 3.4 meters, that erosion had already begun. She intended to extend it. The goal was a finished interior space of approximately 18 by 22 feet, 5.5 by 6.7 meters, dug back 14 feet into the hillside beyond the original cavity, with a ceiling height of 7.5 feet, 2.3 meters at the center. The excavation took 6 weeks. The sandstone she was cutting into was what geologists classify as moderately hard sedimentary rock, dense enough to hold its shape without constant reinforcement, porous enough to be worked with hand tools, and composed of enough silica and iron oxide to give it the warm reddish-orange color that characterized the ridge. This was not soft river clay. Margaret used a combination of picks, chisels, and wooden wedges soaked in water to split larger sections cleanly along the natural bedding planes of stone. What she removed, she did not discard. Every block and slab of sandstone that came out of that hillside went into the construction of the structure's front wall, the only portion of the home that would be exposed to the open air. She laid these blocks in courses with clay and sand mortar, building a wall 24 inches thick, 61 centimeters, with a slight inward batter, meaning the wall was wider at the base than at the top, a technique that increased structural stability and reduced the surface area exposed to wind-driven cold at the most vulnerable point. The entrance she positioned deliberately, a single doorway, 30 inches wide and 6.5 feet tall, 76 centimeters by 2 meters, oriented slightly east to south. This was not an accident. A south to southeast orientation in the northern hemisphere maximizes low-angle winter sun penetration while minimizing direct summer sun, a passive solar principle that Margaret understood through observation rather than formal physics, but understood correctly. Above the entrance, she corbelled 3 courses of sandstone outward to form a shallow protective overhang, shedding snowmelt and directing it away from the door threshold. Beside the entrance, she left a single window opening, 18 inches wide and 14 inches tall, 46 by 36 centimeters, which she glazed with 2 panes of salvage glass separated by an air gap of half an inch, a rudimentary double-pane assembly that, while imperfect, reduced convective heat loss through that opening by an estimated 30 to 40% compared to single glazing. The hearth she positioned against the deepest interior wall, the solid sandstone face at the back of the excavation. This was the most deliberate choice of the entire design. In a conventional cabin, the fireplace was typically placed on an exterior wall or in the center of the structure, with the chimney flue running up through or along the outer wall. This arrangement, while structurally convenient, meant that a significant portion of the heat absorbed by the chimney masonry was radiated directly to the outside, lost before it could warm the living space. Margaret reversed this logic. Her firebox sat against 14 feet, 4.3 meters, of solid sandstone hillside. When she fired that hearth, the heat radiated not into open air, but into the rock mass behind and beside it. Sandstone has a volumetric heat capacity of approximately 40 to 45 BTU per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit. meaning it absorbs and stores a meaningful quantity of thermal energy before its surface temperature rises appreciably. A firebox burning for 3 to 4 hours against that back wall was not just heating the air in the room, it was charging the stone like a battery. The chimney she ran vertically up through the rock mass above the firebox, emerging at the ridge crest some 22 feet, 6.7 meters, above the floor. The length and mass of this flue meant that the rising combustion gases surrendered more of their heat to the surrounding stone before escaping, a principle identical to what Russian and Scandinavian masonry heater traditions had refined over centuries, though Margaret had arrived at it independently, through the same practical logic. By mid-September of 1887, the structure was enclosed, the hearth was mortared, and the front wall was complete. Margaret moved in on the 23rd of September, 2 weeks before the first snow of the season reached the valley floor. Before we get to what happened when the temperature dropped, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Stories like this one, Forgotten Engineering from the Frontier, are exactly what this channel is built for. Don't miss the next one. The criticism had started well before the first stone was laid, when Margaret had described her plan to Horace Pennock, the most experienced builder in Ridgecrest Gulch, a man who had constructed over 30 structures across 3 Colorado counties. He had listened with the patience of someone who had heard a great many bad ideas, and then told her plainly that she was proposing to do something that combined the worst features of a mine shaft and a root cellar and call a home. His specific objections were practical and, on the surface, reasonable. The first was moisture. Any cavity dug into hillside rock would collect seepage, particularly during snowmelt, without continuous ventilation, which a semi-buried structure would struggle to maintain. The interior would become damp within a season. Damp stone, Pennock argued, was a conductor of cold, not a barrier to it. A wet wall drew heat out faster than a dry one. She would be sleeping in a cold, dripping cave by February. His second objection was structural. The natural recess she had chosen showed evidence of past rockfalls, loose material that calved away from the upper face and accumulated at the base. Building into that face, he said, invited collapse. Without proper shoring across the entire ceiling span, one hard freeze-thaw cycle could bring sections of the roof down. His third objection was social, and he stated it bluntly. People would not visit a woman who lived in a hole in the ground. In a frontier community where mutual aid was survival infrastructure, where neighbors came to help with harvest, with illness, with emergencies, isolation was not merely uncomfortable. It was dangerous. Other voices in the community echoed Pennock's concerns and added their own. Clara Voss, whose family ran the settlement's small dry goods store, told anyone who asked that the project was a waste of the labor Margaret was paying for money that could have built a proper second cabin. Reuben Allgate, a farmer whose property abutted the eastern end of the ridge, worried aloud that the excavation would destabilize the base of the rock shelf and affect the natural drainage pattern that fed his irrigation channel. None of them, it should be noted, were arguing in bad faith. The history of frontier construction is full of experiments that failed, buildings that collapsed under snow load, dugouts that flooded in spring, structures that rotted within a decade because the builder had misread the drainage of the site. Skepticism was earned knowledge in communities where structural failure in November could mean death by January. Margaret listened to all of it. She answered the moisture objection by describing the drainage channel she had cut along the interior base of the back wall, a shallow trench filled with gravel that directed any seepage toward a collection point near the front entrance, where it could evaporate or be removed. She answered the structural objection by pointing to the bedding planes of the sandstone above the excavation, which ran horizontally and showed no vertical fracture lines that would indicate a collapse risk. She answered the social objection by saying nothing at all, which Pennock later described as the most unsettling response she gave him. As autumn deepened and the nights grew colder, the criticism in Ridgecrest Gulch shifted in tone, from concern to derisive. The phrase that circulated most frequently, according to oral histories collected by a county archivist in the 1930s, was a short one. She's gone to live with the moles. Margaret, by all accounts, kept building. The winter of 1887 to 88 arrived on schedule and intensified on a different one. October and November were cold but manageable, the kind of cold that tested your firewood supply without threatening your life. December turned harder. By the last week of the month, Nighttime temperatures in Ridgecrest Gulch were dropping to -8 degrees Fahrenheit, -22 degrees Celsius regularly, and families were burning wood at the high end of their usual winter rate. Then January arrived. On the 4th of January, 1888, a pressure system that regional weather observers would later describe as one of the most sustained cold events of the decade settled over the San Juan Range. For 11 days, daytime high temperatures in the settlement did not reach 10 degrees Fahrenheit, -12 degrees Celsius. Nighttime lows touched -22 degrees Fahrenheit, -30 degrees Celsius on 3 separate occasions, and on the worst night, the 8th of January, a combination of dropping temperature and sustained northwest winds pushed the effective felt temperature below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, -40 degrees Celsius, a point where the two scales converge. The log cabins of Ridgecrest Gulch did what log cabins do in a sustained extreme cold. They fought, and they lost ground slowly. Horace Pennock's cabin, one of the better-built structures in the settlement, with 12-inch, 30 centimeters, walls and a tight-fitting door, required continuous fire maintenance around the clock to keep the interior above 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius. He and his eldest son took 2-hour shifts through the night, neither sleeping more than 90 minutes at a stretch. His firewood consumption for those 11 days consumed roughly a third of his remaining winter supply. The Voss family's storehouse, which adjoined their living quarters, lost enough heat on the coldest nights that a barrel of pickled goods in the corner froze solid, the brine crackling and expanding until the stave hoops cracked. 2 of the settlement's smaller cabins, single-room structures occupied by miners who had stayed through the winter, became effectively uninhabitable on the worst nights, their occupants relocating to larger households. Margaret Ellison kept a record during those 11 days, written in the same careful hand she used for her accounts ledger. It has been partially reproduced in local historical literature, though the original document's location is no longer certain. According to those records, the interior of her hillside home on the coldest morning, the 9th of January, the day after the temperature had touched -40 degrees Fahrenheit, registered approximately 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius, without any fire having been lit since the previous evening. She had banked her small hearth at roughly 9 o'clock the night before, using a moderate load of split pinyon pine. She had not risen in the night to reload it. By 6 in the morning, with 11 hours of no active combustion and an outside temperature of -22 degrees Fahrenheit, -30 degrees Celsius, the air inside her stone mass dwelling had dropped less than 8 degrees Fahrenheit, 4.4 degrees Celsius from its peak evening temperature. In Pennock's cabin, the same overnight interval, with active fire maintenance, had still resulted in corner temperatures dropping into the mid-30th degree F, 1 to 3 degrees Celsius. The comparison is not perfectly controlled. The two structures differed in size, occupancy, and design, but the directional conclusion is difficult to dispute. The sandstone mass surrounding Margaret's living space had absorbed heat during the active burning hours of the previous day and evening, and was releasing it slowly and continuously through the night, exactly as she had predicted, and exactly as the physics of thermal mass dictate. Her total firewood consumption for the 11-day cold event, approximately 1/3 of a cord of mixed softwood and pinyon pine. Pennock's consumption for the same period, just over 1 full cord. The difference, roughly 67% less fuel burned for a warmer, more stable interior, was not a rounding error. It was a result of a fundamentally different approach to the problem of keeping a human being alive in a Colorado winter. Ezra Colton, who had stood outside her door that January morning watching the thin ribbon of smoke rise calm and steady from her clay flue pipe, used the word witchcraft when he described the scene to his wife. He said it without malice. He said it because he had no other immediate frame for what he was seeing. He knocked on her door at just after 7 in the morning. She answered in her house dress, holding a cup of coffee that was still steaming, and asked him if he would like to come in and warm up. He stepped inside and stood there for a long moment, feeling the heat of the stone walls press against his coat from 3 directions at once. It was not the sharp, directional warmth of an open fire. It was something older and more complete, the kind of warmth that the earth itself gives off, patient and enormous and indifferent to the storm outside. He took off his hat. By the spring of 1888, the conversation in Ridgecrest Gulch had changed. It did not change loudly. Frontier communities rarely admit a collective error with ceremony. What happened instead was quieter and more telling. People began to ask Margaret questions, practical questions. How deep had she excavated before hitting the stable temperature zone? What mortar mix had she used for the front wall? How had she managed the drainage in the wet season? How long did the stone take to fully charge with heat after a cold start? She answered every question. She walked neighbors through the structure, pointing out the gravel drainage trench, the corbelled overhang above the door, the position of the firebox against the back wall. She explained, in the plain, unhurried language of someone who had thought about something for a long time, why the stone was doing the work that would have always been expected to do alone. Horace Pennock came twice. The first time, he said very little. The second time, he brought a measuring tape. Within 2 years, according to accounts preserved in the Ridgecrest Gulch Township records, 3 families in the settlement had incorporated earth-sheltered elements into new or modified structures. None replicated Margaret's design exactly. The specific geology of the ridge and the labor required to excavate it made direct copying impractical for most. But the underlying principle, using the thermal mass of the earth in dense masonry to buffer against temperature extremes, rather than fighting those extremes with fuel alone, began to appear in how people built. One family extended their root cellar into a sleeping room, insulating the connecting door, and using the cellar's stable ground temperature as a thermal anchor for the adjacent living space. Another built a new cabin with a double-thickness stone rear wall banked with earth on the exterior. Not a cave, but an application of the same logic Margaret had demonstrated. Put thermal mass between the living space and the cold, and let it do the slow, patient work that could not. Pennock himself, in the winter of 1889, added a stone heat wall to the back of his fireplace, a secondary mass of sandstone blocks, roughly 18 inches thick, 46 centimeters, and 5 feet high, 1.5 meters, mortared against the rear of his existing firebox. It was not a sophisticated modification, but local accounts suggest it reduced his morning fire starting time significantly and noticeably extend the period during which his cabin held useful warmth after the evening fire went to coals. He never said anything about it publicly. Margaret Ellison lived in her hillside home for another 19 years, until she relocated to her daughter's property near Durango in 1907. The structure itself, partially collapsed and heavily weathered, was still identifiable in the ridge face as late as the 1940s, according to a brief mention in a county geological survey conducted in that decade. By then, the front wall had largely fallen, and the interior had been reclaimed by the hillside. But the back wall, the true wall, the solid sandstone face that had absorbed thousands of hours of carefully managed heat and given it back slowly through some of the worst nights the San Juan Range had ever recorded, that wall was still there. It had not gone anywhere. It had been there long before Margaret, and it would be there long after. What she understood, and what the community of Ridgecrest Gulch came to understand, slowly and without fanfare, over the winters that followed, was that the mountain had always been warm. The question was never whether the heat existed. The question was whether you were smart enough to use it. The settlers who came to high country brought with them the building traditions of gentler climates. Thin walls, open hearths, structures designed for summer comfort that were then asked to perform in conditions they were never built for. They burned enormous quantities of wood to compensate for this mismatch. They worked longer, slept shorter, and wore their bodies down maintaining fires that a better designed structure would never have needed. Margaret Ellison did not invent earth-sheltered construction. The ancestral Puebloan peoples who had inhabited the cliff faces of the San Juan region centuries before European settlement had understood this principle with extraordinary sophistication. Their south-facing cliff dwellings used solar gain, thermal mass, and passive airflow in ways that modern architects would study and document with genuine admiration more than 100 years later. The vernacular earth house traditions of Central Asia, North Africa, and the American Southwest all carried versions of the same knowledge, that the ground is not an obstacle to warmth, but its most reliable source. What Margaret did, and what makes her story worth telling, is that she arrived at this knowledge independently, through observation and reasoning, in the middle of a community that had access to the same hillside, the same stone, and same brutal winters, and had not seen what she saw. She asked the right question. Not how do I burn more wood, but what does the mountain already know, and how do I listen? If this story made you think differently about how people solved hard problems with the materials in front of them, Hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us what frontier engineering topic you want us to cover next. The history of vernacular building is full of ideas like Margaret's. Practical, proven, and almost completely forgotten. We're just getting started. Educational and historical content. This script is a very similar historical reconstruction. Events, measurements, and dialogue are based on plausible period conditions. Where specific records are unavailable, narrative framing reflects oral history and regional documentation conventions. Not a substitute for professional engineering, construction, or safety guidance.